If you could take one memory away with you from what you did when you were playing, what would it be?
When I did Kung Fu in the Ligan.
Really?
Yeah, because these kind of people don't have to be to the game.
They called him a genius, but Eric Cantona was just as famous for the grudges he carried as the goals he scored. Behind the swagger and the upturned collar, there were rivalries, insults, and outright fights with players he couldn't stand. And today, we're diving into 5 of them, the names that lit the fire in Cantona like nothing else. When people think of Eric Cantona's biggest rivalries, one name stands out above the rest: Didier Deschamps. To most of the world, Deschamps is a legend captain of France when they lifted the World Cup in 1998, a Champions League winner and later a successful manager. But to Cantona, he was nothing more than, in his own words, a water carrier. That insult became infamous in France. Cantona wasn't just mocking Deschamps' style of play, he was reducing him to someone who did the dirty work while others shined, and Cantona made sure everyone heard it. The root of the hatred ran deeper than footballing philosophy. Cantona was the artist, the creative genius who thrived on flair and risk. Deschamps was pragmatic, disciplined, the kind of player managers trusted to follow instructions to the letter. To Cantona, that felt soulless, a betrayal of what football should be. He once went so far as to say that Deschamps would never be anything more than ordinary, even while the rest of the world was celebrating him as France's most successful leader. What made the rivalry sting even more was timing. Cantona's international career ended in disgrace, banned after his infamous kung fu kick in England, just as Deschamps was about to lead France into its golden era. While Deschamps was lifting trophies, Cantona was on the outside, watching his country's success unfold without him. For a man as proud and outspoken as Cantona, that must have felt unbearable. And rather than hiding his bitterness, he poured it into every interview, every soundbite, making Deschamps the symbol of everything he despised about modern football. Even years later, the tension never disappeared. Deschamps went on to become France's head coach, winning the World Cup in 2018. Cantona? He doubled down on his criticisms, claiming Deschamps' success came not from brilliance but from safety, accusing him of playing the most boring style imaginable. The personal jabs got darker too, as Cantona once hinted that Deschamps' squad selections were influenced by prejudice. Those comments caused outrage in France, further cementing how deep this animosity ran. This wasn't just 2 players with different styles, this was a clash of 2 worldviews, the rebel against the institution, the dreamer against the pragmatist. And in Cantona's eyes, Deschamps represented the victory of conformity over creativity. But as heated as this feud was, it wasn't the only time Cantona clashed violently with someone on his own team. In fact, the next story involves a teammate who almost got hit with a pair of boots literally. If Didier Deschamps was the symbol of everything Cantona despised at the top level, Jean-Claude Lemot was the reminder of how brutal his temper could be on the training ground. The 2 played together at Montpellier, but their relationship quickly turned toxic. Lemot was an experienced midfielder, steady and professional. Cantona, still young and fiery, saw him as the kind of player who challenged his authority, and one day, Cantona snapped. During training, frustrated with what he thought was unfair criticism, Cantona launched his boots straight into Lemot's face. The dressing room was stunned. 6 senior players, outraged by what had just happened, went directly to the club directors and demanded Cantona be sacked. To them, this wasn't a hot-headed moment, it was proof that he was out of control. Most players would have been finished then and there, but Cantona wasn't like most players. Instead of being thrown out, he was kept thanks to a divided locker room. Some teammates sided with Lemot, furious at Cantona's violent outburst. Others, impressed by his talent, urged the club to stand by him. The incident created an atmosphere so tense that every training session felt like it could explode at any moment. And it showed the world a side of Cantona that wasn't just controversial, it was downright dangerous. This wasn't a case of a tough tackle or a war of words in the press. Cantona had physically attacked a teammate, a line almost no professional player dares to cross. From then on, Lemot became the face of that story, remembered less for his own career and more for being on the receiving end of Cantona's fury. For Cantona, it was just another battle in a long war against anyone who stood in his way. But while teammates might forgive or forget, there was one group Cantona never stopped fighting. And unlike Lemot, these enemies had the power to punish him again and again. Cantona's hatred for referees wasn't a passing grudge, it was practically built into his DNA. His mistrust of officials began when he was a child. He once told the story of a referee who stopped his game just because his bootlace had come undone. To Cantona, that tiny act summed up everything wrong with authority in football, people in power using rules to control the game instead of letting it flow. From that moment, referees weren't guardians of fairness, they were enemies. Throughout his career, the tension never eased. Every time Cantona disagreed with a decision, he didn't hide his anger, he exploded. Red cards followed him from France to England, with suspensions piling up. He spat insults at referees, waved his arms theatrically, and sometimes refused to leave the pitch without making his disgust obvious to everyone watching. Fans loved the passion, but officials saw him as a nightmare to control. The problem wasn't just his temper, it was his belief that referees represented the system he despised. Cantona saw himself as a player of instinct and creativity, and in his mind, referees killed the artistry of football with whistles, cards, and strict interpretations. The more he clashed with them, the more bans he collected, feeding his reputation as the game's eternal rebel. By the time he reached Manchester United, his battles with referees were almost expected. It wasn't a question of if he would argue with them, it was when, and every incident only made his legend grow. Fans cheered his defiance, while the authorities tightened their grip, leading to longer bans and harsher punishments. For Cantona, referees weren't individuals, they were the faceless embodiment of control, the very thing he fought against his entire career. But as much as he hated them, there were still times when his fury turned directly on his own teammates, and one of those moments ended with a punch to the face. Long before he became the king of Old Trafford, Cantona's battles started in the locker rooms of France. At Auxerre, he showed the same fiery streak that would later define him in England, but back then, it wasn't fans who loved it, it was teammates who suffered from it. One of the most infamous stories involves Bruno Martini, the French international goalkeeper. During a heated argument, Cantona lost control and punched Martini in the face. For most clubs, that would have been the end of the road. A young player attacking one of the team's leaders could have spelled exile. But Cantona's talent was undeniable, and that's what saved him again and again. Managers tolerated his outbursts because they knew he could change a game in a single moment. Still, inside the squad, his volatility created tension. Every session carried the risk of another explosion, another fight ready to erupt from nothing. This wasn't just about anger. Cantona believed that if a teammate didn't match his intensity, they were dragging the team down. That obsession with passion and commitment made him lash out at those he saw as complacent. Martini, Lemalt, and others became lightning rods for his fury, proof that Cantona demanded more than just professionalism, he demanded total devotion to the game. In a way, these fights weren't just about individuals, they symbolized Cantona's war against mediocrity. To him, players who settled for just doing their job were enemies to the art of football. And if that meant throwing punches or boots, so be it. But if clashes with teammates were personal, his more recent feud with Manchester United's leadership shows how far his fury could stretch even years after retirement. Decades after hanging up his boots, Cantona is still fighting battles, this time, not on the pitch, but against the men running his beloved Manchester United. And the target of his rage? Sir Jim Ratcliffe and the new leadership group at the club. For Cantona, the problem wasn't just results on the pitch, it was the soul of the club itself. He accused Ratcliffe of destroying Manchester United, pointing to layoffs, cost-cutting measures, and the controversial removal of Sir Alex Ferguson's ambassador role. To Cantona, these decisions weren't just business, they were betrayals of the traditions that made United special. He went further, criticizing the plans for Old Trafford, warning that the club's identity was being sacrificed for short-term gain. Unlike his feuds with teammates or referees, this wasn't about ego or temper, this was about legacy. Cantona sees himself as a guardian of United spirit, someone who bled for the badge. Watching executives turn the club into what he viewed as a corporate machine was enough to spark his fury all over again, and true to form, he didn't keep his opinions quiet. In interviews, he tore into Ratcliffe with the same blunt honesty that once made him a nightmare for referees. It's rare for a retired legend to call out the men at the top so directly. But Cantona has never played by the usual rules of respect and silence. For For him, speaking out, even if it meant clashing with the most powerful figures in football, was part of his duty. Just as he once defied managers, teammates, and referees, he now defies the executives steering the club he loves. And yet, as fierce as these battles have been, none cut deeper than his feud with his own country. Because when Cantona turned his anger on the French national team, it wasn't just a fight with players or managers, it was a rejection of an entire system. If Cantona's fights with teammates and referees were explosive, his war with the French national team was something much bigger, a grudge that lasted decades. On paper, he should have been a hero for France. He had the talent, the charisma, and the ability to change games on his own. But in reality, his relationship with the French setup was poisoned almost from the start. The problems began in the late 80 seconds when Cantona insulted the national coach Henri Michel after being dropped from the squad. His words were so sharp that the French Federation banned him from international duty for months. That was just the beginning. Every time it seemed like he could become a central figure for France, another incident pushed him further away. To Cantona, the national team represented everything he despised: structure, politics, and pragmatism. He once admitted that France's style of play stood for everything I hate in football. That wasn't just frustration, it was a rejection of the entire philosophy the federation stood for. And it hurt even more when he saw Didier Deschamps, the man he had mocked as a water carrier, lifting the World Cup as captain in 1998 while Cantona watched from the sidelines. The bitterness never faded. Years later, when Deschamps became the coach of France, Cantona's attacks returned laced with suggestions that squad choices were influenced by prejudice rather than merit. His words caused outrage across the country, but they also revealed how deep the wound ran. For Cantona, the French national team wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a symbol of betrayal, a reminder of how his own country turned its back on him at the peak of his career. And that's what makes Cantona unique. His grudges weren't small or fleeting, they grew into lifelong rivalries, still burning long after his boots were hung up. Looking back, the list of players and figures Cantona hated says as much about him as it does about them. Didier Deschamps, the safe captain he mocked as ordinary. Jean-Claude Lemoult, the teammate who felt the sting of his boots. Bruno Martini and others who clashed with his fiery demands. Referees, who to him symbolized the death of creativity. Modern leaders like Jim Ratcliffe, accused of destroying the club Cantona once ruled. And finally, the French national team itself, the institution he could never love, no matter how many trophies it won. In every feud, the same theme emerges. Cantona could not stand conformity, control, or compromise. He lived for passion, artistry, and rebellion. And anyone who didn't share that vision became an enemy. That's what made him both loved and hated. A genius and a troublemaker, a legend who never played by the rules. The real question now is, if Eric Cantona was still playing today, who would he be at war with? Which players, managers, or executives would he call out without hesitation? Because one thing's certain, Cantona never changed for anyone, and he never will.